Imagine waking up from a dream and becoming convinced that you helped murder someone. You don't remember committing a crime. You don't remember standing at a crime scene. You don't remember seeing the victim. You only have fragments, images, feelings, flashes that don't feel like memories at all. Now imagine telling the police about those fragments. And imagine that instead of telling you to forget the dream, they start asking questions that make the dream feel more real. Then imagine naming your best friend. That is where Ryan Ferguson's nightmare began. Not with a murder weapon, not with DNA, not with a fingerprint, but with a young man's uncertainty about what he could no longer remember. Almost 10 years later, Ryan would walk out of prison a free man. But by then, the world he had known as a teenager was gone. His 20s were gone. And the murder that started it all was still unsolved. So how did a teenager with no physical evidence tying him to a murder end up with a 40-year prison sentence? And perhaps the more disturbing question is this: what happens when a memory you aren't sure is real becomes evidence? To understand that, we have to go back to a cold Halloween night in Missouri. Not to the courtroom, not to the prison, but to a newspaper parking lot where a man was about to die. It was the early morning of November 1st, 2001, in Columbia, Missouri. The night before had been Halloween, but inside the Columbia Daily Tribune, the night was ending like any other. Kent Heitholt, a 48-year-old sports editor, had finished his work and was heading toward his vehicle in the newspaper's parking lot. There was nothing about that moment that suggested he was walking into the final minutes of his life. Then something happened in the darkness. Two men were seen near Kent's vehicle. The details were confused. The lighting was poor. The night was dark. And before anyone could understand what was happening, the figures were gone. When workers approached the vehicle, they discovered Kent on the ground. He had been brutally attacked and strangled with his own belt. Within minutes, the parking lot was filled with police lights. The victim wasn't an anonymous stranger. He was a well-known newspaper editor in a small Missouri community. The pressure to solve the case began almost immediately. Investigators searched the scene. They collected fingerprints. They examined footprints. They looked for biological evidence. They interviewed witnesses. They searched for anything that could tell them who had attacked Kent Heitholt. But the evidence didn't immediately point to a name. And that would become one of the most important facts in the entire story. Because the crime scene contained evidence. What it didn't contain was a clear connection to Ryan Ferguson or Charles Erickson. The case slowly became a cold case. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. And months became years. The killer remained free. Then, 2 years after the murder, something happened that would completely change the investigation. But it wasn't a new fingerprint. It wasn't new DNA. It wasn't a confession from the killer. It was a newspaper story. And inside the mind of a 19-year-old man, that story triggered something terrifying. Charles Erickson had been 17 on the night Kent Heitholt was murdered. He had been drinking heavily at a local club called By George. He was with Ryan Ferguson. Both were teenagers. And Charles had blacked out. He couldn't remember everything that happened after leaving the club. For years, that missing stretch of memory was simply a blank. Then, the murder appeared in the newspapers again. Charles began thinking about that Halloween night, and something inside his mind began connecting pieces that had never been connected before. He started having what he described as dreamlike memories, images, fragments, a feeling that he might have been somewhere near the murder. A terrifying possibility began forming in his mind. What if he had done it? What if the blackout wasn't simply caused by alcohol? What if something had happened that night, and his mind had buried it? Charles eventually approached Ryan. He told him about the disturbing thoughts. Ryan rejected the idea. According to Ryan, they had been drinking, but they had not murdered Kent Heitholt. For Ryan, the question was simple. They hadn't done it. But for Charles, the uncertainty was becoming unbearable. And eventually, his doubts reached the police. On March 10th, 2004, detectives brought Charles Erickson in for questioning. This should have been the moment when investigators separated memory from evidence. Instead, the interrogation would become the turning point of the entire case. Charles didn't walk into that room saying he remembered committing the murder with certainty. He was uncertain. He was confused. He was trying to understand his own memories. And then the questioning began. The interrogation room was small. A young man sat across from detectives. He didn't have a clear memory of murdering Kent Heitholt. But the detectives had something Charles didn't have. They had the crime scene. They knew what had happened to Kent. They knew details that had never been publicly discussed. And as the questioning continued, those details began entering Charles's story. He struggled to remember. He guessed. He corrected himself. He tried to make sense of the images in his head. And the more he talked, the more specific the story became. Eventually, Charles confessed. Then came the question that would change another teenager's life. Who was with you? Charles named Ryan Ferguson. On that same day, police arrested Ryan. He was still a teenager. He wasn't caught at a crime scene. He wasn't found holding a weapon. He wasn't confronted with DNA evidence connecting him to Kent Heitholt. He was taken into custody because his friend had implicated him. And suddenly, the story had a suspect. But the question remained, where was the physical evidence? The answer would become one of the most important weaknesses in the prosecution's case. Ryan Ferguson was still in high school when his life changed forever. Imagine sitting in a classroom, thinking about graduation, college, friends, and everything that comes after high school. Then the door opens, police walk in, and everyone in the room realizes something is terribly wrong. Ryan was arrested and accused of murder. For his classmates, it was shocking. For Ryan, it was incomprehensible. He knew what he had done that Halloween night. He had been with Charles. They had been drinking. He had driven. And he had gone home. But police now had Charles's confession, and Charles had named him. The investigation had suddenly transformed. Ryan was no longer simply a teenager with an ordinary future. He was now a murder suspect. And the prosecution had a theory. Ryan and Charles had supposedly decided to rob Kent. The theory gave the case a motive. It gave the prosecution a story. But there was a problem. The crime scene did not give them Ryan. No physical evidence placed him there. No fingerprint tied him to Kent's vehicle. No biological evidence established that Ryan had attacked Kent. The case was becoming a battle between a story and the absence of physical proof. And in 2005, that battle moved into a courtroom. Inside the courtroom, the jury didn't hear a story about a dream. They heard a prosecution case built around testimony. Charles Erickson took the witness stand. The same young man whose memories had once been uncertain now told the jury that he and Ryan had participated in the murder. But Charles had a reason to testify. He had pleaded guilty and received a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation. Then came another crucial witness, Jerry Trump. Trump had been working near the newspaper building on the night of the murder. His identification of Ryan became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. And suddenly, the prosecution had what it needed, a confession. An eyewitness identification, and a theory of what happened. But the physical evidence still didn't connect Ryan to the crime. That contradiction should have been impossible to ignore. Yet trials aren't decided by a single piece of evidence. They're decided by how jurors interpret everything placed in front of them. And the prosecution had something extremely powerful on its side, a confident narrative. Ryan was portrayed as the person who had drawn Charles into the crime. The jury listened. The witnesses testified. The defense challenged the state's case, and eventually, the jury reached its decision. Guilty. Ryan was sentenced to 30 years for second-degree murder and 10 years for first-degree robbery. 40 years. He had entered the case as a teenager. Now the law said he could spend most of his adult life behind bars. And just like that, the courtroom doors closed behind him. But Ryan's story was only entering its darkest chapter. Prison changes time. For someone sentenced to 40 years, the future becomes almost impossible to imagine. A year doesn't feel like 12 months. It feels like another wall, another locked door, another birthday, another Christmas without your family, another year of watching the world move forward without you. Ryan entered the prison system as a young man. Outside, his friends were growing older. People were going to college, starting careers, falling in love, building families. Inside, Ryan was trying to survive a life he insisted he had never earned. He began studying. He exercised. He learned about law and post-conviction procedure, and he refused to let the prison define him. But there was another person fighting outside. His father, Bill Ferguson. Bill did not accept the conviction. He didn't simply tell people his son was innocent. He began investigating. He studied the evidence. He examined the trial. He looked at witness statements. He searched for inconsistencies. He kept pushing. And slowly, something remarkable happened. Ryan and his father began fighting the same battle from opposite sides of prison walls. Ryan fought from inside. Bill fought from outside. And neither of them knew how long it would take. Then, years into Ryan's imprisonment, the case reached a lawyer known for taking on wrongful convictions, Kathleen Zellner. She began examining the case. And the more she looked, the more unstable the original prosecution appeared. because now the witnesses who had helped put Ryan in prison were beginning to tell a very different story. Charles Erickson had spent years living with the consequences of his testimony, but as time passed, he began questioning what he had actually remembered. The dreamlike images, the blackout, the interrogation, the confession, and the story he had told at Ryan's trial. Eventually, Charles recanted his testimony implicating Ryan. He said he had not actually seen Ryan commit the murder. He said his earlier account was not a reliable memory of what had happened. For Ryan, this was enormous, but it wasn't enough. One witness had changed his story. The conviction still stood. Then investigators turned to Jerry Trump, and his story was about to become even more complicated. The prosecution had relied heavily on Trump's identification, but questions emerged about how that identification had been formed. What had Trump actually seen that night? What happened after the murder? What information had he received? And what had been withheld from the defense? The answers would become central to Ryan's fight for freedom. Trump eventually recanted his identification as well. Now something extraordinary had happened. The two witnesses who had been central to the conviction had both backed away from the testimony that helped send Ryan to prison. But the state still didn't simply open the prison doors. Ryan was still behind bars. The conviction was still on the books, and now the case had to enter its final battle, a legal battle over whether the original verdict could still be trusted. The Missouri Court of Appeals examined the case, not just the original testimony, not just the confession, but what the defense had known and what it had not known. One of the most important issues involved evidence concerning Jerry Trump's ability to identify Ryan. The court concluded that the state had withheld material favorable evidence relating to that identification. That mattered because Trump's testimony had been one of the key pillars supporting the conviction. The court's conclusion was devastating. Ryan Ferguson had not received a trial whose verdict was worthy of confidence. His convictions were vacated. The state was given the opportunity to decide whether it would retry him. But there was a problem. After years of litigation, the prosecution's case had changed dramatically. The confession had been recanted. The eyewitness identification had been recanted, and the physical evidence had never provided the connection the prosecution needed. The state ultimately chose not to retry Ryan. After nearly a decade behind bars, Ryan Ferguson was going home. November 12th, 2013. Ryan Ferguson was released. He was 29 years old. When he entered prison, he had been a teenager. When he walked out, he had spent almost his entire 20s behind bars. He didn't walk out with the life he should have had. He couldn't recover the birthdays. He couldn't recover the years with his parents. He couldn't recover the education, relationships, experiences, and ordinary mistakes that make up a person's 20s. But he could walk. He could breathe. He could see his family. And when Ryan finally reunited with his parents, the years of waiting suddenly became real. The prison door was open. The nightmare was over. But there was one thing that still hadn't been solved. Kent Heitholt was still dead, and whoever actually killed him had never been convicted. Ryan was free, but the murder remained. That is what makes this case so disturbing. There are really two stories here. The first is Ryan Ferguson's. A teenager was convicted. He spent nearly 10 years in prison. His conviction was vacated, and he was released. The second story belongs to Kent Heitholt. A newspaper editor went to work one Halloween night. He never came home. His family never got the ending they deserved. And the question of who killed him remained unanswered. Ryan's exoneration did not solve Kent's murder. It only answered a different question: whether Ryan Ferguson's conviction could still be trusted. The court said it could not. And that distinction matters. Because justice is not simply about putting someone in prison. Justice is about getting the truth right. And when the wrong person is convicted, the real killer remains free. Years after Ryan's release, his story became a symbol of wrongful conviction and the dangers of unreliable testimony. But the most haunting part of the story isn't the prison sentence. It isn't the courtroom. It isn't even the dream. It's what happened when uncertainty became certainty. A teenager didn't remember a murder. He wondered whether he had committed one. That doubt became a confession. The confession became an accusation. The accusation became a conviction. And a teenager who insisted he was innocent spent almost 10 years behind bars. Eventually, the conviction collapsed. Ryan walked free. But one question remained suspended over that Missouri parking lot. Who really killed Kent Heitholt? Because Ryan Ferguson's nightmare ended on a November night in 2013. Kent Heitholt's never did. And perhaps that is the darkest lesson of this case. A justice system can sometimes correct a wrongful conviction, but it cannot give a murdered man his life back, and it cannot give an innocent man back the years he lost. All it can do is keep searching for the truth until someone finally finds it.